Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Atomi Brainwaves, our podcast on education for educators. Brainwaves is produced by our wonderful team here at Atomi. What is Atomi? It's an online teaching and learning platform for secondary education. We provide engaging, curriculum-specific video and text lessons for over 190 subjects, as well as matching quizzes and exam practice that can be used for both learning and formative assessment. We also provide powerful analytics that can help teachers diagnose how their students are progressing and zero in on who might need a little bit of extra help. Our goal is to help make life easier for our teachers, give them more time to work on the most important things, and ultimately help to generate better outcomes. If you want to find out more about Atomi, head over to our main site at getatomi.com and feel free to try it out for free. This week, I had the chance to chat with Heather Clayton Staker, founder of Ready to Blend and best-selling author on disruption in education. We discussed the issues in traditional schools that disruptive innovation can address, the strategies and theories behind how Heather and her team implement these changes, and the developing attitudes in US schools towards these new techniques and resources. If this sounds like your kind of thing, feel free to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your podcast listening, and we'll always be happy to see a quick 5-star review while you're at it. For now, take a listen and enjoy.
Are you going to teach us anything?
What, you want me to teach you something? You want to learn something? All right. You got it!
Hey everybody, welcome back to Atomi Brainwaves. I'm your host Simon, and today I'm joined by our very special guest, Heather Clayton Staker, founder and president of the US-based educational resource Ready to Blend, researcher and best-selling author in the field of disruptive innovation in education, and global spokesperson for student-centered learning. Welcome, Heather.
Hi, Simon.
How are you?
I'm doing great. It's great to talk to you.
Yes, I believe you were coming today from your daughter's birthday, is that right?
That's right. I have a 13-year-old. She's my middle child. So I have a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old, and then also a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old. So as I talk to you as a researcher, I also have the head of a parent. As I look at innovation in education, it definitely hits me at a personal level as well.
Yeah, definitely all across the board. Oh, no, all about that. There's 5 kids in total. Is that
That's right.
Is that correct? Well,
That's
I
right.
come from a family with 6 kids, so very familiar with the kind of pandemonium that can be involved there. But I guess
That's a
happy
good word to
birthday.
describe it. Well, thank you.
Yes.
That's a good word to describe it, especially as schools are closed with the pandemic. The level of pandemonium has probably increased, it would be fair to say, in the Staker household.
Yes, without a doubt. And as good a time as any to say to our listeners, if any of that pandemonium is heard in the background, we apologize in advance, but hey, it adds to the flavor, adds to the fun, I like to think. But anyway, enough of that. Let's get into our conversation. And the central idea of what we're going to talk about today is kind of an area of expertise for you, which is disruptive innovation in education. Before we get into all that, though, as our regular listeners will know, whenever we've got a guest on, we like to start by just getting a quick run through of your journey in education, where you started, what happened along the way to lead you to where you are today.
Sure. So imagine your favorite company in the world, your organization that you just think is so innovative, who has done the most amazing things. Some people might name Elon Musk and Tesla. Some people might say IKEA has just revolutionized furniture. I was just running for some exercise this morning around our neighborhood, and I was thinking about how grateful I was for my workout gear. That the fact that synthetic fibers have been invented have done so much to improve the quality of life. Imagine if I were running around in like woolen wear or cotton or a burlap bag or something. But just even the invention of these more sophisticated fibers on a daily basis, they impact our lives. And when I started working for the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation about a decade ago, that was really the problem that I signed on to help solve, was look at all the innovations that have improved lives in other sectors of the economy and the world. Can we do more to innovate in K-12 education? And rather looking at our vexing problems as being those that require us to just redistribute resources? Can we instead attack them through a lens of innovation? So I began my work in education as a professional there, and then went on to do several things. I founded a co-op preschool. I've worked at an online learning company. I have helped start several different school programs. Where it has led me to this point is in 2015, I co-authored a book called Blended, Using Disruptive Innovation to Improve Schools with Michael Horn. And we felt that the message was necessary to send to the world that, look, there's all of these online resources that allow us to deliver the right lesson at the right time, at the right way, to the variety of learners. And how could we blend those into our brick and mortar experiences? And after that book came out, I had a lot of opportunities to do keynote speeches and to share that message with teachers and school leaders. And then I found that people were starting to be familiar with that message, that it wasn't a novel idea anymore, but what people wanted was help implementing it. And so my keynote work shifted into workshopping, where I really met with groups of, say, 50 or 100 teachers and school leaders at a time and helped them roll up their sleeves and say, how do we do this? How do we actually bring new structures into our schools to improve teaching and learning? And then from there, I started deputizing other folks to go out and do that training on my behalf. And so now there are 150 Ready to Blend facilitators around the world who help schools and help their own schools predominantly, leading their own professional development sessions to think about how do they redesign and really redesign with students at the center, and then think about how teaching and curriculum and facilities and budgets and staffing all get put back together again, but in a way that optimizes for the best interests and needs and abilities of each learner. And so that's where I am. That's been the journey, and that's what I'm still doing today, is empowering mostly school leaders and teachers to run their own professional development programs based on these principles.
Wow, that's amazing. I have to say, I feel a bit guilty now when you started off with that really interesting thought of thinking about companies, that sort of changed the game. I guess you had such wholesome examples, and my first thought was like, oh, the YouTube maybe, or Netflix, right, or something. But I suppose in their own way, they fall into that camp. But yeah, I think it's quite fascinating that you sort of came into education from that perspective of straight out of the gate disruption and how that could be brought into the mix, because a lot of guests that we've had on, or people you would talk to, they almost started from the opposite perspective. If it was either just becoming a teacher or really taking on any role in education, starting out from a point of view of going along with the flow of the river and realizing along the way all of the things that needed to be changed. But it sounds like for you, it was kind of from day one, it was this perspective of what can I bring in a disruptive sense. Would that be fair to say?
It is. Well, if we zoom back to when I was 17 years old, so this was a few decades ago at this point, and I was appointed to be the student member on the California State Board of Education. So in the state of California, there's one 17-year-old, a senior in high school, who flies to Sacramento, the state capital, and lives there for a week each month and votes on education policy for the whole state, with the idea being that the students should have a voice. So I had a very unusual 17th year of life, and during that time had such an up-close look at the bureaucracy, at the full California Department of Education, which goes on and on. There are multiple floors in this building, miles and miles of file cabinets I remember roaming through, and at the time, I felt pretty powerless. I didn't know very much about education code or curriculum frameworks or all of the ways that you could impact the system. But what I did see was that it was a big bureaucracy. And that really was kernel of my desire to go forth and say, how can we innovate and streamline? And I mean, you mentioned Netflix and YouTube, and I would guess partly what makes those interfaces fun for you is that they're simple, they're convenient, they're affordable. And can we look for those same opportunities in education?
Yeah, absolutely. And also geared towards the user, I guess.
That's right.
Which is another part of this, which we're obviously going to get into, about how, putting students at the center of the whole experience is key. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to, I guess before we get around to the solutions, best place to start is the problems. And you've touched on it a little bit there, but I wanted to kind of take a deep dive into why exactly this disruption is needed. What it was/is in traditional classrooms, going all the way up through the levels. You talk about the bureaucratic level. We can start there and then move our way down into actual individual traditional classrooms. But what is it about those old systems that, from your point of view, needed disruption, needed changing, needed innovation?
Sure. So I'll share a story with you that to me crystallizes it. And this is the story of a trip that I took to an education conference. It was not in Europe, so it was not in your part of the world. It was not in the United States. I'll leave it at that. I'm going to, for the sake of this country, not mention where I was, but I will tell you that I met a young man there who was a beautiful architect. He had created a building that was in the town that was just beautiful. And he also had near perfect English. And I started talking to him. I was fascinated about his story and how he'd become such an accomplished architect at a young age. And he shared with me that when he was 10 years old, his father had been offered a job in Florida. And so he moved with his family to Florida and enrolled in the local school. And within days, the teacher at this primary school informed his parents that this young man had dyslexia. And they didn't know what dyslexia was. In fact, in their home country, there wasn't a direct translation for the term dyslexia. And this Florida school was able to diagnose that barrier to his learning and then also recognize his genius and develop an individual education plan for him that helped him soar to the point where he went back to his home country, took a job as an architect, and became very accomplished in his field. Now, the interesting thing is, had he stayed in his original country of origin, his life would have taken a very different turn. He would have been grouped with a cohort of 6-year-olds and then traveled through the primary system and secondary system all the way through till the end before university in that same cohort. It was pretty stark in its exemplification of this idea of just standardization. So same cohort, 0 electives. Once he got to secondary school, he had no opportunity to choose if he perhaps wanted to focus more on art or focus more on a performance arts or on engineering. Nothing like that. No accommodation for any special needs he had or diagnosis for his dyslexia. His life would have been very different had he stayed in that country for all of his schooling. The example of what happened to him in Florida, to me, typifies what we're talking about when we say student-centered learning. And it's this idea that isn't new for really as long as compulsory education has been around in the developed world. There has been a call for more personalized forms of education, for allowing students to move at their own pace, for allowing the curriculum to bend and yield to the needs of each learner. But what's different is that with the emergence of some new innovations, primarily internet-based tools, that ideal of allowing us to design a system that bends and yields and tailors to the individual needs of each learner is now becoming within reach. And that's what we mean when we say student-centered learning. Our traditional classrooms have a bunch of design inflexibilities that make it hard for them to accommodate individual differences. And it make it hard for the teacher to pause in the middle of a lesson and address a concern or a question of an individual, meet with this individual one-on-one, conference with them. All of those structures are very hard in a traditional classroom that still has a lot of sit and get instruction. And so the ideal is more of a student-centered system that empowers learners with tools and guides and a variety of learning pathways so that they can move through the system in a way that's more tailored to their needs. It really contrasts what I was describing as a 17-year-old, this big monolithic blob of a bureaucracy where it's just the bureaucracy and the system imposes the routine on these anonymous learners. And instead, what we're seeing is a shift towards putting the student first, before the politicians, before the state, before the teachers, before the curriculum frameworks, and deciding what that learner would best serve that learner, and then bringing the tools together to light that on fire for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really terrific story of that guy in that unnamed country, which shall remain nameless.
I don't want any mafia bosses coming after me or something.
Yes, sorry, I didn't realize it was for those reasons we were keeping it nameless, but worry not, we won't push you for an answer on that front. But I guess as it sort of inspiring as that story is, and as much as it can act as a template for what can be achieved, unfortunately for every one person who has that fantastic journey, there are a multitude of students who might have done just as well given the same opportunity, but unfortunately could not. Even today, in a scenario where, as you say, we have so many more resources and possibilities. And I guess to go back to what you referenced, the kind of bureaucracy that you came up against, to what extent does that represent an obstacle for disruption? To what extent does the kind of, official policies, the decision makers at the top of the pyramids, obviously it's different depending on the country, and it's a different story. But some places are a lot better at kind of being unified in terms of thought and making changes. Others, there's a lot of different voices and things can move at a glacial pace. But I know this is sort of a big picture kind of thing, and we'll zoom back down in a moment. But to what extent do you think, even in a moment like now where we do have so much more capability, are these bureaucracies kind of posing a barrier to the kind of disruptive change that can make a really positive difference?
It's an excellent question. And
Thank you very much.
think that it is an excellent question because we are talking predominantly about schools that are public schools. Most of the schools are run in this world are run by the government. And so one could argue that the disruptive forces that transform other sectors are not at play in a public system. And I do think that countries that have the basic principles of a free market at play are much more amenable to allowing disruptive innovations to percolate up. And so on that note, the regimes that are more authoritarian or communist, that don't have as many free market principles in play, are going to have a harder time providing that fertile ground from which disruptive innovations can emerge. That being said, I'm actually quite bullish on disruptive innovations even in the public sector. They tend to find their way. And when I say disruptive innovation, I mean an innovation that's not as good as judged by the traditional way of judging a system, but it offers a new value proposition. So convenience, affordability, accessibility, and typically disruptive innovation gets its start serving non-consumers. That means people whose alternative is nothing at all. And they say, well, look, I would love to be able to go to a local video store and rent a DVD, but it's too far away, it's too cold outside, I don't have a car. I'm just going to hop on Netflix and stream that movie into my home. And then over time, that convenience becomes so alluring, combined with the fact that Netflix figures out what to do to attract even more customers and to make it appealing even to people who have a video store next door that they could walk to. They still are enticed by Netflix because Netflix over time improves its game and offers a bigger variety, and there's the ecosystem of streaming technology improves. until look left, look right, all of the video stores have gone out of business. That's disruptive innovation. And even in the public sector, it seems to be that the grass finds a way to grow between the cracks of the sidewalk. And typically what you want to look for is pockets of non-consumption. So as you look in the field of K-12 learning, where is it that there's a missing learning opportunity? Oftentimes that's where the disruptive innovation will get its start. So at the elementary school level, oftentimes students don't have a way of getting homework help or learning a foreign language, or maybe continuing to learn during after-school care. At the secondary school level, the non-consumption is even more abundant. So elective courses that aren't available, courses that a student couldn't fit into their schedule because of scheduling conflicts. Perhaps they're traveling for a sport, for athletics, and so they miss some learning. All of those are areas of non-consumption where what we're seeing is online learning creep in as a disruptive innovation to solve those gaps. And it's really not because of the bureaucrats, it's not because of a policy change, it's because of a disruptive enabler, which is online learning, combined with enough of a free market system that it allows for those opportunities to take hold.
Yeah, I really like that as a way of framing it, because it's definitely the most political and economic that we've got on this podcast so far, but it is an important way to think about it, and we'll get into the specifics of it in a moment, but this idea of, the economy of education and how that works, and I suppose it's definitely not just a fascinating, but actually a productive strategy almost to look at it as this kind of filling in the gaps and, as you say, the grass creeping up and sort of the public policy side of things almost having no choice but to take on what's being offered because it is filling in those gaps so effectively and making itself through its own progression and grassroots development so essential to students.
Yeah, and let me just say in response to that to the teacher it doesn't feel like a political or an economic decision at all. To them it feels like, wow, my learners in this rural part of town have an hour and a half that they're spending on the bus. I wonder if we could put a hotspot on that bus that would allow my learners to get their homework done while they're driving home. And so it's just an engaged teacher who has a heart for the reality of her learners and the fact that they're wasting an hour and a half on that bus ride, who thinks, is there a better way to use that time? So it really, when you're living the experience, it doesn't feel political or economic. I'm just saying that those economic preconditions then allow the teachers or the schools to go forth and procure the hotspot and those various elements that they would need to actualize the vision. But when it really, from a user's point of view, what they'll feel is they'll see an opportunity. They'll say, wow, it's too bad that we don't offer Arabic as a course at our school. And there's some learners here who want to learn Arabic. And it turns out that in a neighboring province, they are developing really beautiful online courses to teach Arabic. Perhaps we could use that to address that learner need. And that's what it feels like from an educator's point of view.
Yeah, no, of course. And, as you say, from the teacher's perspective, this isn't an economic issue, and it is just interesting to look at it in terms of those broader trends. But we will now pivot away from that into the more specific lane of what this means for teachers, and we're going to do that by talking specifically about the disruption itself. So what it is that you do, what you can bring to a school, to a teacher, to a classroom in terms of introducing this disruptive education. I know blended learning is a massive cornerstone of that, which is something that we've covered on the podcast before, but can't hurt to have a refresher of it on blended learning. And I guess following on from that, what the strategies are for introducing that and other forms of disruption into the classroom.
Sure. So just to continue with the story of disruptive innovation, I mentioned that online learning is appearing to be a technology enabler that breaks down many of the design constraints that in the past have dictated that a class has to be a certain number of minutes in a day, that it has to be configured relatively in a certain structure, that cohorts of age-based students progress through the system in a linear path. And online learning allows for a rethinking, a reimagining of what are the various pathways and various paces and different guides along the way that could help a learner move more organically based on where they are in their learning. And so that vision came about with online learning, but then the question was, well, how about our brick and mortar schools? And students still needed to go to brick and mortar schools. For one thing, just the practical concern of parents were working and they needed a place for their children to be. And then the social aspects and the love and the care that they get from the human contact with a teacher is so critical. And so online learning couldn't be just this distance learning idea of, oh, well, great, now you can access your assignments and your lectures online, so just everyone work wherever you want. It doesn't matter to come to school anymore. No, for the majority of students and families, they still want to go to that brick and mortar community. And so blended learning is the blend of that online potential into our brick and mortar. And so at my organization, which is Ready to Blend, I focus on how do we equip teachers to use the possibilities that online modality brings to them. So really simply, one of the things that teachers do sometimes is a flipped classroom, where they, instead of having their students go to school and do the lecture and then go home and do the assignment, that's flipped. And you've probably talked about this on previous podcasts, but they do the online learning ahead of time from home, and then they come to school for the lecture. So that's a very simple entree into blended learning, but just it's indicative of the types of new models for teaching and learning that are possible because online learning is blending into schools.
Hey folks, hope you're enjoying the episode so far, and we've got plenty more to come after this quick break. Here at Atomi Brainwaves, we're all about education, and not just for students, for ourselves too. We would love to hear from you, whether that's feedback on one of our episodes or a question you'd like to see answered by one of our guests or by Sue. So, if you've got a comment or a question, don't hesitate to email us at brainwaves@getatomy.com. Looking forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, let's get back to it. Yeah, awesome. And as you say, we talked about it before, but always good to get a refresher from an expert in the field. Let's talk a little bit about resources for a moment, if we can, because obviously it plays such a huge role in disruption in education and blended learning, and it's obviously something very important to us here at Atomi, given that that's our whole MO. I wanted to ask you about what do you look for in a resource that is going to bring value in terms of disruption to a classroom? What does it look like? Which applies, by the way, both to online resources, and obviously that's going to be a significant part of the conversation, but even offline resources, or how well an online resource combines with the offline within the classroom. What does an ideal resource look like?
Yeah. Well, let me start with a different version of a resource, just to get a little bit philosophical with you. The first
Sounds good. Love getting philosophical.
You love. Well, I have a podcast. If you're not going to get real philosophical.
First politics, then economics, now philosophy. We're hitting them all.
But before talking about resources and the way we usually think about resources, I want to submit that one way of thinking about a resource is a mindset, that your mindset is a resource. And so one of the resources in that sense that seems to be the most useful for schools is a mindset of embracing change, embracing entrepreneurialism. And the schools and the teachers who are willing to just be slightly open-minded about what teaching and learning need to look like and be willing to change are the ones who seem to have the most success. In fact, when I've surveyed school leaders, the number one competency that they say they're lacking in their staff is just the mindset of being willing to experiment with shifting from teacher-led to student-driven learning. So I'm going to throw that out there as one resource, because I actually think it is a huge resource that is potentially a gap, is the human resource of embracing change, being willing to try stuff a little bit different from in the past and experiment. So that's the first thing, the first resource. The second category of resources that I'll name would be the content resources. So tools that allow learners to access content at their own pace that they control. So whether that is a full online course or whether it's more of playlist with resources, it's a system that helps them track where they are. Maybe it's digital badges that help them earn points and recognize where they are in their learning. Anything in that category that helps give power to the learners so that they can see the menu of options and then have some power to drive their own learning. Those are the content resources that are really helping to change the world for the learners. And then the third type of resource that is just so critical would be the coaching resources. And so those are the people, the whether they're face-to-face or online guides, and in many cases a combination of both, that guide the learners, that love them along the way, that show them the unconditional positive regard, that give them feedback, and that build relationships of trust. And that is a resource that's just absolutely critical as we combine it with the content resources.
Yeah, and all key, and how they interact, all of the above is so important as well, isn't it? Getting the right balance between each of these things, the human element, both in terms of open-mindedness and the guide, the teacher, being there for the student, and also that balancing out correctly with what's being offered online. That's, I would imagine, super important as well.
Yeah, there seems to be this sweet mix when you get all three of those working together that leads to the most growth. One thing I've found with teachers is that when you hear my story, at first maybe you start feeling panicky because you think, that's so much change. And how would I take my traditional classroom and change it to being something that's really student-centered and learner-driven, and learners are moving at their own pace and earning badges, and it just sounds like a lot to build. But I want to just share that the fascinating thing that I hear on the other end of it is once you have flipped some of your lessons and built some of these content pieces and tried it, then teachers say, I would never go back to the old way because I have so much time for human connection, one-on-one tutoring and mentoring and connecting with the child. And if someone is not there because something in their life is amiss, the teacher finally has a way to minister to them and find out what it is. And that is revolutionary. And in this world right now, particularly, I would say, with some of the complexities in it, the fact that there are innovations that are allowing teachers to get more human and individual one-on-one, it's just so wonderful. I think it's really an opportunity that teachers love as they go through sort of the tunnel of misery of getting it built.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's definitely a place worth striving to get to for any teacher. But while we're on this subject, I wanted to ask if we can consider point A to be the position you talked about, where a teacher is just totally fazed by all of these changes and, oh my God, how am I going to do all these things? And then we consider point B to be this perfect finishing position of, they've mastered what's going on. They've mastered how to implement this disruption, and it's opened up these avenues for having that extremely valuable face-to-face guiding interaction with the student. In terms of the space between those two things, the A to B, where yourself or another ready-to-blend coach comes into the mix, I wanted to talk about that journey. What are the common challenges that arise as a coach from getting the teachers from A to B, how you can overcome those? What, from your perspective, what does that journey look like?
Sure. So oftentimes the first question I hear is, what technology should we buy? What learning management system do we need? What software do we need? And a similar question I hear is, which blended learning model should we do? What's the right instructional model or learning model? And neither of those questions is the easiest place to start. The easiest place to start is by thinking through, what are my goals? What do I want to make possible for my learners? Do I want more individual time to coach them? Or is it that they're struggling to get their homework assignments done, and so I want them to do those assignments in class? Or, if I'm being honest, are my lectures dreadfully boring and I want to find a way to increase engagement in my classroom? And so getting very honest around what are the problems and opportunities that I want to go after, that's the starting point for the teacher. And just forget about the technology, forget about all of the building choices, and instead think about, what do you aspire to for yourself and your learners, and what kind of an student experience do you want them to have, and would you want to create for them as a teacher that would be the most rewarding for you? And then from there, you can start to look at the different models that could allow that to happen. So for example, a flipped classroom, which we discussed, it looks very different from like a station rotation where you're meeting in class with your students and they're rotating from station to station, and one of them is an online station. And that looks very different from an a la carte model where students are doing a fully online course. Maybe you have a learning cafe at your school now and they're doing a fully online course with an online teacher. And that looks different from a flex model where the learners are predominantly working through their own playlists online, but there's a face-to-face guide who's pausing to launch the discussions, to meet and mentor, to enrich the learning with hands-on projects. So that is another opportunity for a teacher. And after you're clear on your goals, what opportunity you're going after, what problem you're trying to solve, then you can start to think through, well, which of these models might help me make this goal happen?
Yeah, which kind of ties back into what you were saying when we looked through all of those phases of, the mindset interacting with the resources, interacting with then the relationship with the student. It kind of one follows on from the other. Almost the first thing that needs to be cultivated is the mindset, is the approach, and then everything else kind of stems from there. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I was really thinking about change this week because my children are homeschooling right now, which has been a big change for our family. And some of the projects that I started at the beginning of this year have taken a different course because of the things that have happened in the world in the intervening months. And I realized that I was feeling so uncomfortable. I was just feeling anxious. And once I noticed that it was because of change, but changes that weren't necessarily even bad. There were some good things about the changes. It was just the human discomfort with change. It was easier for me to then navigate it and to almost embrace it. And I think the same thing is true in innovating in schools, that there might be some anxiety and some concern about changing from how we're currently thinking about teaching and learning. But if we recognize that that's to be expected, that is a human reaction to any time that we're venturing into the unknown, and then turn to guides, turn to resources that can help you and take those steps, I do think it leads to living a better life as a teacher than if we always just stay in our comfort zone and never are willing to take a step into that challenge zone.
Yeah, and it kind of actually ties itself neatly into what I wanted to ask you next, which was almost a little more on the theoretical sides, because I know something that kind of pops up in your research and your writing is this idea of the theory of hybrids. First of all, I wanted to ask if you could explain what that is for us. What is the theory of hybrids?
Sure. So when a disruptive innovation emerges, people who were going about their business as they were ahead of time see that disruptive innovation, but they don't really know what to do with it. So an example was when Toyota saw the electric battery. They said, wow, that's interesting. Instead of just a gasoline-powered automobile, what if there could be some sort of a battery-charged automobile? And they noticed that potential disruptive technology, but they weren't ready to completely abandon their gasoline-powered cars. They didn't know how to make a purely battery-operated vehicle. They were used to selling for customers who expected some of the conveniences that petroleum offered. And so rather than just completely abandoning their whole fleet of gasoline-powered vehicles, they said, what if we create a hybrid? It'll be the best of both worlds. We'll put a battery into a Toyota Prius, and so it'll have both gasoline and electrical charge, and you can have both. And so it was a way for them to go to market and offer the best of both worlds, ostensibly, to their consumers. And it's become the number one selling hybrid vehicle in America, the Toyota Prius. We see a similar phenomenon in schools. The incumbents, that means those who are already doing their thing, see the disruptive enabler on the horizon. They see online learning, and they don't want to completely just throw out their lesson plans, throw out their classrooms, and just say, we're doing a full flex model from now on. It's going to be 100% flex. No, that feels troubling, and you don't even know how to do that. And so instead, what we're seeing a lot of schools do is create more of a hybrid, where they say, we'll take our traditional classroom, and then we'll blend in some components of the online learning, and hopefully offer our families the best of both worlds. And so when we talk about flipped classroom and station rotations and lab rotations, those models of blended learning are more hybrids, where they're really preserving a lot about the traditional classroom, but blending in online learning to add some of the benefits that can come from that control of time and pace and pathway and the gamification elements. And so those are the hybrid models. And then meanwhile, we're seeing what we call pure plays, which are where really the whole design of the traditional classroom goes out the window, and instead schools are creating these new learning studios that center on tools and guides and pathways that are optimized for the learner. And when you walk into one of these types of studios, you can't even tell where the front of the classroom is anymore. It's such a pure play disruption relative to the traditional classroom model. And so both strategies, I think, are important. I think that hybrid strategy of taking online learning and blending it into your traditional can bring some good improvements to sustain your existing classroom model and to bring vitality to it. But then meanwhile, the real pioneers in education who want to get out of the lead of what the future of learning will look like, they're starting to experiment with the more disruptive models and thinking through what would a high school secondary experience that was all flex model really look like, where those learners were equipped and empowered to have customized schedules and set their tutorial schedule and their seminars and do project-based learning. And it's much more fluid and based on the needs of each learner. What might that look like? And how could we create a new school or a school within a school or maybe a summer school pilot to try to figure that out?
Yeah, the opportunities are endless, and I suppose you can kind of see the rationale for either avenue, can't you? Because, on the one hand, you can totally understand how from a school's perspective taking a total leap into the deep end can be quite scary, whereas kind of slowly going in to the shallow end and working your way along seems to make more sense. So you can understand that rationale for the hybrid side of things. On the other hand, if there is a disruptive innovation that you truly believe is going to add so much more value, in that situation, it makes perfect sense to fully embrace that. I imagine, though, that for either direction you take, they kind of pose their own unique challenges along the way. So I guess we'll start with hybrid, then we'll go to pure play. But what are for school as the kind of the larger institutional entity trying to navigate through a transition into either of these models, what are the biggest challenges that you perceive to be, and how should a school approach them?
One of the challenges for the hybrid model is to configure the right team of people to bring that about. If you're looking at a flipped classroom and you already have devices accessible and you already have some digital content available, then often you can just empower those teachers to flip the classroom themselves. They don't really need what would be called a heavyweight team made up of experts from across the organization coming together to figure out how to flip the classroom. And so allowing the teachers enough autonomy to flip the classrooms themselves would be the most important response to that challenge. If you're envisioning more of a station rotation where perhaps the fifth grade students are reading buddies with the first grade, and it really affects operations and budgets and staffing, then it's incumbent on the school leaders to form a team that includes experts from across the school and that can come together and re-architect how that school will function. So I think that's one thing to get right as you're looking at the hybrid models is this something that teachers can just do on their own? Or is it more of an architectural level change where we need to be proactive about creating a team that can come together and figure out what does our school look like with a more rigorous blend of online learning infused into the classroom structure?
Okay, fantastic. And now we'll go for option B. We'll flip to the Pure Play. Sorry, it is Pure Play. Is that right?
Pure Play, yeah.
Pure Play,
sure,
yes. Sorry, I just got
disruptive.
Yes, I got really paranoid there that for some reason that was wrong and I had butchered the name. But yeah, so same question I guess for the Pure Play side of things. What do the challenges look like there, and what's the ideal approach to take to navigate them?
One of the biggest challenges with those purely disruptive models, so a flex model or an enriched virtual or an a la carte blended model, is organizational resistance. So suppose that you go to your very best English composition lecturer and say, guess what? We're going to set aside your years of carefully crafted lectures and replace them with these beautiful playlists of content that learners can navigate themselves. Well, I'll tell you that all hell will break loose because the teacher doesn't want to hear that. The parents don't want to hear that. There are numerous political organizations that do not want to hear that. And so it's a really bad idea. So the biggest challenge as you're navigating those disruptive models is to look for pockets of non-consumption where it's a pure opportunity. We don't offer an Arabic course. No one's threatened by bringing in an online Arabic course. And P.S., while we're doing that, we can start thinking through how do we make this learning experience really take off for each student? Do we need to have a learning cafe? Do we have the right devices? Is the online teacher interfacing in the right ways? Does there need to be a face-to-face guide? And if so, what did they do along the way? All of those questions get explored, but you're creating a safe harbor to do that innovation work without the community piling on and shutting down your effort. So really being smart as innovators about your strategy and looking for pockets of non-consumption, places where the opportunity is nothing at all. Now, interestingly, in the world right now, there are so many schools that are closed that the world is awash in pockets of non-consumption. And that's why you see so many schools that are moving to online learning and distance learning right now without the community throwing up their arms. It's because the alternative is nothing at all. And when you are in a world where the alternative is nothing at all, that is the most fertile ground for disruptive innovation. And so we are seeing it everywhere right now. And these disruptive models all over the place. And that was not true 4 months ago. 4 months ago, everyone wanted to know how to do a station rotation. Everyone wanted to know how to do flipped classroom. It was all about the hybrid models. Now everyone's saying, how do we do these purely disruptive models?
Yeah, which is so fascinating. And just to go back for a second, what I quite enjoyed the parallel, when you're talking about within the school and its surrounding community, this idea of finding the pockets of space, it kind of mirrors what we were talking about earlier in terms of the broader trends with relation to public policy, this idea of finding those pockets of space and letting it grow within them to the point where the previously skeptical majority can look upon it and say, wow, there's so much value being brought there. It's almost, even if you do want to oppose it, it's hard to, because you can't ignore the evidence that's in front of you of how valuable that is. So it's just very interesting to see how that kind of maps itself down from the top level all the way down to just one individual school.
I think you connected the dots on that really well. Maybe you need a job at the Christensen Institute next, because that is exactly true. That is exactly
tempting.
True. But you did. I mean, not everyone really homes in on that theory point of view. But what you just identified is that disruptive innovations tend to find a way to rise up if you give them some field where they can grow. So some areas of non-consumption where they can prove that they're simpler, more convenient, more affordable, more accessible, and then they're like a magnet, and they just people will be drawn to them. In fact, one phenomenon we're seeing quite frequently right now are micro schools that are outside the public system but are affordable because they're using more of a flex model, and people are drawn to those. They want that. They want for their children to have a more student-centered learning experience. So there are various ways that these disruptive models, these pure play disruptions, are taking root.
Yeah, fantastic. Which, as you pointed out there, some amongst us, such as myself, can just naturally pick up on. Others maybe need it explained, but that's okay too. Nothing wrong with that. I guess we've touched on it a little bit there, but I wanted to kind of close out our discussion by talking about the kind of the present moment and where the wind is blowing with relation to disruptive innovation in education, because, you know, obviously it goes without saying the present situation with in terms of the lockdown, in terms of the pandemic, what everyone is facing is changing so much. But obviously, so that's going to be a huge factor as part of this. But even outside of that, different factors feeding in over the past few years, what would you say the prevailing mood is at the moment with regards to disruption? Is it something that is becoming increasingly accepted? You know, obviously, you know, you're going to know best in terms of US schools, but even beyond that, if you can speak to a global context, where do you think we are in terms of the temperature right now, and where are we moving towards?
My observation from the teachers who I meet with is a level of fear that I haven't seen in the past, and I think it's because they're looking at the potential for teaching in a way that's very different from what they've experienced in the past. And like we've discussed, change can feel uncomfortable. And yet, it's also one of the most beautiful ways to inspire, to grow, is to be open to change. So I do think there is a level of discomfort right now as people are being asked to get outside of their comfort zone and think about doing their jobs in a different way and meeting learners' needs in a different way. I want to say on the other side of that, though, and I described this tunnel of misery, but when you get through and you start seeing that you were able to empower your learners and you were able to give them content and coaching in a way that lets them, sort of like that young architect I told you about at the beginning, where he wouldn't have been able to soar had he not gone to a school that was more student-centered than his country of origin school. And now we're taking that same idea of really thinking about diagnosing each individual's strengths and weaknesses and individual needs, and then giving them even more tools and better guides to help them realize their potential. We are creating a better world for them. So even though there's fear and discomfort right now associated with the change, we've got to lean into that faith that because we're pioneering some models that have so much opportunity to be more student-centered, we're going to come out of this a better people. And I'm fully convinced of that.
Well, it's a great mindset to have, you know, and as much as you're right, there is fear, and of course that's a natural impulse and reaction when faced as we are right now with a really difficult situation in lots of different regards. There is, I suppose, you know, the cautious optimism that the kind of good you're describing can come out of it. So a hopeful note to end our discussion on disruptive innovation rather in education on. However, we're not quite finished, because we always like to end by getting from our guests it can either be a little piece of advice for teachers out there, or just a little fun anecdote from your own experiences in education. Can be more serious, can be more light in tone, whatever you're feeling. But before we go, Heather, we're going to ask you for your fun piece of advice / anecdote for our teacher listeners out there.
My advice is, don't run down the grocery aisle before you've learned how to sit in the cart. And what that means is we started this conversation by discussing these big families. And I don't know, did your mother ever take you grocery shopping with her?
She did. I don't know why she did. It must have been an absolute nightmare with all of these small children. But yes, she did.
So I came from a family with 7 children as well. And when my mother took us to the grocery store, at first we'd be like strapped to her in some sort of a baby carrier. And then we'd be put in the cart. And then once we were learned to sit in the cart, we could sit in the cart. And then once we were toddlers and we could walk, oftentimes we could walk alongside her and kind of hold on to the cart or ride alongside it. And then as we became even more responsible and conscious, we were able to maybe go down the aisle and fetch what she would need from the aisle. And then by the time we were older children, we could go all over the store and get the things we needed, and oftentimes things she didn't want, and put them into the cart. And there's an analogy there, not only for our learners, but for ourselves. So for our learners, many of them are experiencing online learning right now for the first time. And in some cases, just saying, here's your lesson, here's your assignment, go for it. It's like saying, wander around the grocery store. You got this. Instead of giving them those incremental experiences to help them get to the point where they're ready to handle their autonomy. The same thing is true for ourselves. That right now, as we're thinking, there are so many opportunities in education. And I just expressed some real optimism around the potential, if we do this right, to make a better world. And I do think that potential is there. But that being said, we don't want to let ourselves just run all over the grocery store yet. We need to start with learning how to kind of be in the baby carrier and then sit in the cart and then walk alongside it. And so what does that look like? It means looking at one lesson that you're comfortable with and thinking through, how could I take this lesson and turn it into content that my learners could access according to their own timing and according to their own ability level. Looking at one increment of time on your calendar and thinking, how could I use that time to coach an individual student? And just looking for those incremental steps forward. And knowing, because most people who are listening to this are teachers, we know that humans need to develop within their zone of proximal development. And just like a child needs those baby steps, we also need to set realistic, one lesson at a time mindsets for ourselves, and know that over time they will accrue into something great. But it really comes from just looking at one individual task and thinking through, how can I empower my learners? How can I make this something that they can tackle themselves so that my time is freed up to be a better coach? That's how we get started.
Well, I have to say your words there have served as kind of a hybrid of their own, both a wonderful piece of advice and for me a complete trip down memory lane to my own youthful years alongside my siblings in the supermarket. So thank you very much for that double whammy. So that is all that we have time for today. Heather, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us and sharing your wisdom and expertise.
Thank you.
We won't keep you from your daughter's birthday anymore. We'll let you get back to that. To everybody listening, hope you enjoyed it. If you want to hear more, you can listen to more episodes on whatever platform you're listening to this on, and check us out at our main site at getatomy.com. For the time being, it is goodbye from Heather.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from me. See ya.